I'm thrilled that Dr. Deborah Lipstadt, the Dora Professor of Jewish History at Emory University in Atlanta, has joined us on the screen. Deborah's just flown from Atlanta to New York, where she's speaking tonight at Temple Israel in New York City at Rabbi Gelfan's congregation. He apologizes, he's on this NAB group, and he apologizes he can't be two places at once. Deborah and I have been friends for virtually, well, it's not quite a half.
Since before you applied to rabbinical school.
That's true. Deborah was very true. And Deborah actually,
because I wrote the recommendation.
And she's regretted it ever since.
That's true too.
Like many of us in this room, Deborah also once worked for the Union, but the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. She was the regional director of youth, or at the time it was called NEFTY, the Northeast, the New England Federation of Temple Youth, while she was working on her PhD at Brandeis, and since has become a worldwide leader in understanding anti-Semitism. And we've invited her today to spend a few minutes with us to help us understand how anti-Semitism in the United States has changed in the last several years as compared to the last century. And Deborah has a book coming out in January, Anti-Semitism Here and Now, and those of you who are members of the NAB will receive a copy of that book with our compliments once it's out. And we also want to understand the differences between the European nationalist right-wing political scene that we're watching and how that's impacting anti-Semitism in Central Europe. But mostly we're interested in North America today. And finally, there was a wonderful article in the December issue of the Forward magazine that's an excerpt from Dr. Lipstadt's book, where she asked the question, but what are the dangers of our obsessing over security and fighting anti-Semitism rather than investing in building vibrant Jewish life? And so with all those as an introduction, Deborah, welcome and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm speaking to you from a hotel room, so where I've just arrived in New York, as Danny said. It's a pleasure to be with you, except I'm with you for not such pleasurable circumstances. I have to say, I listened to the last few minutes of the previous conversation, and one of the people, someone at the end, I don't know who it wasn't Jeremy, so whoever it wasn't Jeremy was, said, don't worry, people get used to it. And that's true. We get used to the security, but it's very sad to me that we get used to it. It wasn't always like this. It's been like this for a long time in Europe. In Europe, you know that if you're looking for a synagogue, you find the street, and then you don't even have to know the number of the building on the street. You just look for the police cars and the machine guns. In the UK, you look for the CST and their distinctive vests or whatever it might be. But there'll often be a police car there too. And it's sad that we have to get used to it. That's a big tragedy. The article Danny referred to in this month's Forward, which is a direct part of the conclusion of my book, is that we are now stretched between oi and joy. And we're gonna, I worry that for too many people, what is done to Jews becomes their mode of Jewish identity rather than what Jews do. How Jews die, how Jews suffer is much more familiar to them than how Jews live. And I'm not discounting in any way the need to pay attention to the bad stuff, but it becomes the motivating factor. Having said that, let me turn to the bad stuff and just give you what they say in Hebrew, a tamsit, the essence of some of the issues, and then Danny, can we open it up to questions or whatever? Will that work?
Yes.
Okay, good. I think there are a number of things that are important, and I've written this, but it bears repeating. First of all, we're sort of sitting in the midst of the perfect storm. We see anti-Semitism on the left, BDS, the leaders of the Women's March, Reverend Farrakhan that, oh, I don't know whether he's left, right, or whatever. He sort of occupies his own place in that sense. But we see it increasingly on the left and institutionalized, so that students on campus who are maybe pro-Israel, but consider themselves progressive, hence they care about ecology, they care about the Me Too movement, sexual attacks, sexual assaults on women, etc., find themselves forced to choose. Even people involved in LGBTQ efforts find themselves forced to choose either be with us on the progressive issues and give up Israel, or if you're standing strong, or you call yourself a Zionist, even a progressive Zionist, a liberal Zionist, a left Zionist, whatever it might be, you can't be with us on those issues. This has been long-standing. It's not new. And for many years, that's where the focus of the Jewish community, particularly, but not only the North American Jewish community, has been. What we've seen in the past, I would say 7, 8 years, but with more intensity in the past 2.5, 3 years, is anti-Semitism on the right. It's not new, but what is different is the way those on the right feel emboldened to openly express their anti-Semitic views, the way they feel it's okay now. I don't want to get into a debate about, the leadership of our country, particularly the president. Let me just say what I think in this case. I don't know if he's an anti-Semite. I doubt it. He's very proud of his Jewish grandchildren, his Jewish son-in-law, his daughter, who's a Jewish daughter, et cetera, et cetera. But what is true is that whether he has intended to or not, he has given what those on the far right accept as dog whistles, green lights, imprimatur, whatever word you want to use, to engage in anti-Semitism, to engage in right-wing rhetoric in a way that they didn't before. It didn't mean they didn't think these things before, but now they feel it's okay to say them publicly. And even if he backtracks from it, if there's a storm of criticism and he happens to backtrack, those on the right simply say, oh, well, the Jews forced him to backtrack, but we know what he really thinks. This is what happened during the campaign when David Duke expressed his strong support of him. And I don't know if it was Lester Holt or who was doing the interview, asked him about it. And he said, I know nothing about David Duke, so I can't disavow his support. Of course, he did know something about David Duke, because a number of years earlier, he had said the Republican Party shouldn't make common cause with David Duke. And only after there was a storm of criticism did he say, no, I disavowed David Duke. And then David Duke said, aha, he was forced to do this. So we see it on the right, we see it on the left, and of course we see it amongst many Islamist extremists, Islamist imams, and I'm being very careful here. I don't want to tar and feather the entire Muslim community, because that would be engaging in the same kind of prejudice, but we also must recognize that it's coming from there as well. And that has been, for many years, that has been more overt in Europe. And now, of course, it is more overt in the United States, even before Pittsburgh, but since Pittsburgh, even more so. What those on the far right see on the left, the people say, I'm a progressive. How could I be an anti-Semite? I mean, you see this, and Jeremy can acknowledge, I'm sure knows this well. If you say to Jeremy Corbyn or those people around him, what you're saying is anti-Semitic, they look at you as if you're coming out of another planet. Because to them, I am a progressive. I am a progressive. My whole life I've been a progressive. I've been this committed liberal. It is oxymoronic to accuse me of being anti-Semitic. Therefore, you must have some ulterior purpose, ulterior motive in doing so, and usually they will find that ulterior motive in your being a Zionist, you're being a supporter of Israel. On the right, for a long time, those on the far right felt that they should downplay their anti-Semitism. It should sort of go under the radar and present themselves sort of like the alt-right does, clean cut, not overtly anti-Semitic, not overtly racist, so that they could garner more support. But some of that need to hide or disguise what they're doing is passing. So I think we're facing a very difficult situation. I have to also say that I was less shocked by what happened in Pittsburgh. I mean, of course, I was shocked. 11 people being massacred in a synagogue when all they've come to do is daven or see one another, but I don't know how to say this. In normal circumstances, I would say pleasantly surprised, but of course there was nothing pleasant about it. But by the degree of outpouring of interest, of outpouring of support that we saw, and that has been something that is, we have to remember that even as we are so concerned about this situation, and even as we mourn those losses. I'm headed to Pittsburgh on Thursday for a forum sponsored by the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. That's the newspaper that put the Kaddish on the front page. But to try to keep that in mind as well. So let me stop here. Danny, if you want me to touch on any of the points, just ask. Otherwise, I'm happy to take questions.
Sure. People in the room, questions you want to address to Dr. Lipstadt? Not, I'm glad to start.
Okay, go ahead.
Can you talk about Central Europe for a moment? There's this strange alliance between these right-wing parties which are tolerating anti-Semitism, but being very pro-Israel, and and very friendly with Netanyahu.
Right.
About the business to Yad Vashem and the like.
Right. You saw the article on Yad Vashem from Mati Friedman on Sunday. I addressed this in the book. We've seen this for a while. Viktor Orban, the prime minister of Hungary, the Polish government, Austria, they've all engaged. Orban certainly has engaged in overt anti-Semitism. His vilification of George Soros, and just as an aside, you can disagree with George Soros. You can think George Soros is completely wrong in his approach to things. You can disagree with him politically, but the attacks on George Soros are covertly, and maybe you can drop the C and say overtly anti-Semitic. Soros has become, as one pundit, I think it was David Hirsch in the UK, who has studied left-wing anti-Semitism very closely, Soros has become the 21st century Rothschild. And the way he was depicted, the way he was talked about, it was clear to every right-winger, clear to everybody with a little bit of anti-Semitism in them. And sometimes I think that's a wrong thing to say, because I think of anti-Semitism as pregnant. You either are or you're not, and you may be on a slippery slope. You may be at the top of the slope, but you're headed in only one direction. Was an overtly anti-Semitic attack. The Polish government, in its Holocaust law, it was at the best softcore Holocaust denial. And Holocaust denial is a form of anti-Semitism, as I've written about and talked about and testified about and been in trial on, et cetera, et cetera. So, and then in Austria with the right-wing government there, the irony of the leader of the Austrian government, a right-winger from a party with Nazi, not neo-Nazi, Nazi roots, leading a conference on anti-Semitism. It was, you thought you were in Helm, it was just crazy. But what has happened? Prime Minister Netanyahu, politics makes strange bedfellows. Prime Minister Netanyahu has chosen to make common cause, certainly with Orban and certainly with the Poles, in that sort of what he described as wonderful agreement with the Poles on the law in July, I believe it was, end of June or July, which wasn't a change in the law at all. It really, what it did is it said that, it changed the punishment from I assume people are familiar with it, from a criminal to a civil defense, but offense. But it eliminated the protection for scholars and artists, et cetera, et cetera. And Netanyahu ballyhooed this as a great agreement with the Poles. It was no great agreement. And if you want to see, three of the historians, the leading historians at Yad Vashem and Yehuda Bauer, probably the dean of Holocaust studies, so to speak, blasted it. But for Netanyahu, he makes the calculation that these countries are supporters of Israel. Certainly, they're all members of the EU, and the EU, who he can count on their votes, and he can't count on the votes of Western European countries. So, you know, he has made common cause with them. Now, I can't judge his political decisions. I'm not the prime minister. I don't have the responsibility for that. But I can say it does throw into question his claim that Israel speaks for the Jewish people on anti-Semitism. I say this quite explicitly in my book. It will get me into a lot of trouble, but it won't be the first time. And I feel it very strongly. I am absolutely livid about this. At the same time, I'm livid by the of the attacks on the left on Israel and the right wing, budding right wing, et cetera, et cetera. But I think this is a very short-sighted a decision. I mean, the Polish government now wants to decide who will be the next head of Polin. I'm sure many of you have visited Polin, that amazing new museum, or not so new anymore, on the history of the Jewish people, right in the middle of the ghetto square opposite the memorial to the Warsaw Ghetto. The Polish government wants to train the guides at Auschwitz. So you will, and it may happen slowly. I mean, the staff at the Auschwitz Museum is a magnificent staff. The head of the museum is a terrific guy. And they have been honest and they have been straightforward, but they all may slowly, not right away, but quietly lose their jobs if the Polish government or a Polish government institution begins to train the guides. Then when you go through Auschwitz, and you have to go through Auschwitz with one of their licensed guides, in part to protect them from people like David Irving leading tours in Auschwitz and others, unqualified people, but you'll get a very different story. You'll hear about the Jews suffered and the Poles suffered and we suffered together, et cetera, et cetera. Certainly there were Poles who suffered. One of the first things the Germans did when they came into Poland in September 39 was destroy the Polish intelligentsia, go after academics, leading priests, that infrastructure that could have been the source of a rebellion or a protest against them. Poles suffered terribly, but many, many Poles, did they collaborate with the Germans? The Germans weren't so interested in collaborating with them, but they certainly turned Jews in. You read memoirs of Polish Jews in hiding who were more afraid sometimes of their Polish neighbors than of the Germans stationed in their towns. And all this is going to go by the wayside. And then the Poles who are going to be raised on this are going to say, what are the Jews complaining about Polish anti-Semitism? Aha, they hate us, that, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very complicated, very difficult situation, and a very depressing situation. And I'm very sad about this division between the state of Israel and American Jewry on this issue. Other issues we can debate, but certainly on this issue.
Thank you. Peter?
Don, I'm curious if you see any connection or how we as Jews should respond to the attack on the Charleston church not that long ago,
Mm-hmm.
and our recent experience, because they seem to come from a similar place.
Absolutely. Well, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, should we be making more common cause with the people who attack African Americans as we defend our synagogues?
Well, certainly there were rabbis who came to Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston. I was just in Charleston. I went to the church. If you're in Charleston on a weekend, skip the Sunday morning brunch and go to Mother Emanuel. Wear a kippah, wear something that designates you as a Jew. I think that's important. But there were rabbis who went, in fact, including rabbis from Pittsburgh. And then the leadership of Mother Emanuel Church went to Pittsburgh. They were in Pittsburgh. So there has been common cause there between two congregations, two religious institutions that have been deadly wounded by this. I think, of course, we make common cause. Of course, we speak out against the racism. We speak out against Islamophobia, even as we speak out against Islamist anti-Semitism, or we speak out about anti-Semitism coming from someone like the Reverend Farrakhan, which is overt anti-Semitism. I mean, there's no way you make common cause with people who make common cause with the Reverend Farrakhan. His most recent statement was saying, "I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm anti-termite." Well, what do you do to termites? See under Holocaust. We don't have to answer that question. We know what you do to termites when you find you have termites in your house. Who you call? But of course, we make common cause. But we do it. It's a two-way street. It's a two-way street. If I'm going to make common cause with you, I expect you to, not out of sympathy for me and not because you feel sad for me. And let me just, to elaborate on that point, the Monday after the events in Pittsburgh at Emory University, the students organized a really magnificent vigil. And one of the students who spoke comes from Tree of Life Synagogue. She'd been confirmed there. Her mother had been confirmed there. Her grandmother had been confirmed there. And her great-grandmother worked in the office. That's Yiddish. That's Yiddish. The most important is working in the office, because then you know all the things that go on. She spoke, another student from Pittsburgh spoke. It was a student-organized vigil with the chaplain of the university, and it was really beautiful. And at the vigil, a number of my colleagues came up to me to express really heartfelt sympathy. They came up with tears in their eyes to say how sorry they felt and to express it to me. And I accepted it with tuv lev, with a full heart, and I understood. But to some of them, to the ones I was particularly closest to who would understand, I said, I so appreciate your empathy. I so appreciate your sympathy. I so appreciate your hugs. But know that this is not just an attack on us. These attacks may start with the Jews, but they don't end with the Jews. And ultimately, it's an attack on not only other minorities, but on democratic institutions and on democracy itself. So of course we have to be vigilant about other attacks. But I think, and whether it's homophobia or misogyny or racism, whatever it might be. But at the same time, I'm not going to sell myself cheap. I'm not going to say, because I care about this movement, I'm going to march behind someone who makes common cause with an overt homophobe, overt anti-Semite. And I'm sure you understand my allusions there.
But
if not, I'll spell them out.
Barbara?
Thanks. Deborah, can you give a few examples from your studies or your travels? What are the institutions, whether synagogues or JCCs or others, that do the best job of balancing the security, the speaking against anti-Semitism, and keeping the joy in Judaism that you write about in the article that we just saw a piece of?
I don't want to single out certain institutions. I was very deeply touched. I'll tell you something. I don't know, some of you may have seen me on CBS Sunday Morning News yesterday with Rita Braver. The link is up if you want to watch it. And in the end, I got verklempt, and as soon as the cameras went off, I turned to Rita Braver and I said, "You're going to use that segment." And she and the producer said, "We are," and they did. I got verklempt because I never dreamt we would need security like this in synagogues in America. I'm used to it in Europe. But in America, it's a new thing. But one of the things that touched me deeply, and looking at a balance, and this is just one example, is many of you know about what happened at Teachers College, Columbia University, where there is a professor, a woman of, I think, 77, who's a psychology professor, who has studied Holocaust victims, Holocaust survivors in a psychological context. And she's very open about her Jewish identity. And she came to her office about, I don't know, it was a couple days before Hanukkah. And there on the wall were two giant swastika and the word Yid. And we have no idea who did that. But she said, it broke my heart when I read this, because this is exactly what it's all about. She said, well, they accomplished their goal, I'm afraid. And then 2 or 3 days later, I read that on the campus of Columbia University, she lit the Hanukkah menorah.
What?
She lit the menorah. She was the one asked to light the Hanukkah menorah. I think it was on the first night of Hanukkah on the campus. And that's a balance between, for me, a balance between the joy and the joy. We can't be blind. I mean, you just had a whole session on security, and we have to pay attention to security. It's imperative that we do. It'd be negligent if that we didn't. But we've got to just, each of us individually, to our children, you know, and I have a friend who's very active in Jewish affairs and things like that, who said to me not long ago that he his second marriage. In his first marriage, he has older kids, and he comes from a strong Jewish identity, Jewish background. He's knowledgeable, and he said to me he's so sorry that he didn't educate his two sons, his older sons, in you know, Jewish tradition and Jewish life and Jewish living, etc. But then he said, but I'm very proud of the fact that if there's ever an attack on Jews, they're at the barricades. They're the first ones there. They're not hesitant. They're not ashamed. They're going to fight for their fellow Jews and fight against those who would attack us. And I didn't say anything, but my heart broke, because they, as I said earlier, they know how Jews are attacked, but not how Jews live. So Barbara, I think it was Barbara who asked the question. I can't tell you one particular institution, but all our institutions have to find that balance. We can't be blind to what happened to us, but at the same time, we can't let that define us. I think that starts with us individually, moves to our synagogues, moves to our JCCs, moves to our federations, our other institutions and organizations.
We got one more question, Elise.
Hello. It's been a long time since I've seen you.
Is that Elise?
It is. It is.
Hi there. Hi there.
So you have been teaching generations of young people, Jews and otherwise, at Emory, and I wonder what changes you've observed in the resilience of our young people, not only to manage anti-Semitism. I think that's clear in the moment that they come forward, but I'm really interested in what you observe about their desire to re-engage, their comfort or fear about being engaged in Jewish community, and specifically in synagogues. What kinds of things you've seen change or shift over time?
It's a great question, Elise. I'm a social scientist, but I can only answer that anecdotally. You know, and the students who come through my door are not the students who have decided to chuck doing anything Jewish for 4 years. But I do know that there are students, I've spoken to enough of them, and not just at Emory, but at Columbia and other places. And Emory's a pretty quiet campus politically. Thank God for that, because I couldn't handle it if in my home institution I had to fight all these battles as well. But I've heard it from students at Columbia and Michigan, where they've had to, Oberlin, where they've had to choose. They've written about this, where they've had to choose when they arrive, am I going to be an overt progressive, or am I going to be someone who identifies Jewishly? And I think we see more of that. I think they're also flabbergasted by this expression of anti-Semitism. We were all flabbergasted, but maybe those of us who are a little bit older than the students on campus today sort of remember enough to know that this is familiar stuff. They are just, to borrow a British phrase, gobsmacked. They are absolutely shocked by this. And I think some of them will run the other way because they don't want to spend 4 years on campus fighting. Look, I've heard this from the World Union of Jewish Students and the various different Jewish student unions in different European countries, that they've seen some kids coming to campus, strong Jewish identities, but when they're on campus, they're just going to go neutral because they don't want to struggle all the time. And I can't criticize them. you don't come to college to fight that fight. You don't come to college to always be engaged in that. It's Danny, Elise, and lots of people sitting in this room, you, me, we experienced that birth of identity in the late 60s, where, it used to be if you said day school, you didn't have to define it as day school. It was obviously an Orthodox day school. Now, if you say day school, you have to say Reformed day school, community day school, conservative, whatever it might be, Orthodox. Before, if you saw someone wearing a kippah, you assumed they were an Orthodox Jew. Now that's not the case anymore. We came out of the closet, if I can borrow that phrase. We became proud Jews. We marched and we identified and we rejoiced in who we were. And my great fear now is that there will be people who will go underground, who will go, again, to use that phrase, back into the closet. Look, the CNN poll, which was commissioned before Pittsburgh, and I don't know if you saw the BBC today, but the EU just released the poll, which confirms the same thing. But the CNN poll regarding the Netherlands, and I don't know if there's anybody there online from the Netherlands, that over, I think, 50% of the Jews in the Netherlands are reluctant about expressing their Jewish identity. And I've heard I used to hear this only in Europe, but I've heard this from American parents as well, who've said to their kids, when you go out, take your maganda if they didn't put it under your shirt, not out of your shirt. And one mother, this was a Belgian mother who said it to me a couple of years ago, but I've heard it subsequently here in the States too, who said, I was embarrassed to ask and glad when they did it. So, none of us saw this degree of this coming. We've seen hints of it, but, and yet at the other hand, and maybe to end on a affirming note, I read, that at 6th and I, the iconic synagogue in Washington, D.C., some of you may know it, on the Friday night after the Pittsburgh massacre, as in many synagogues throughout the world and certainly throughout our nation, people gathered at synagogues. And there was a lineup outside the synagogue, a long line, even before the doors opened. And it became clear to the synagogue staff that they wouldn't be able to accommodate everyone. So on the spot, they made a decision to have a second service. But at the first service, the place was jammed. And the rabbi, I forget her name, Shira Shulman, I think it is. She stood up at the beginning of the services and she welcomed everyone, touched by the crowd that had come. And she asked first for all those, she said, I'm going to ask you to identify yourself. But first, I'm going to ask all those who are not Jewish, who have come to be with us, to rise. Then I'm going to ask those who are Jews, but don't usually come to services and certainly not here, to rise. And then I'm going to ask those who are members to rise. And the first group, the non-Jews, over 60% of the people there stood up. That's something to hold in your heart too. That's something to remember. That, sometimes we're alone, but sometimes we're not. And I think that's that balance of that joy and that joy. And once again, I've gotten completely verklempt and I gotta go give a speech. So I wish you all well. I'm not usually such a verklempt person. Danny can tell you that. And don't tell my students I got this way, okay?
Deborah, thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome. Thank you all. I would say enjoy the book, but when I started writing it 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, I knew it would be relevant, but I never dreamt it would be this relevant. And for once in my life, I would prefer not to be relevant. Thank you all very much. Take care.
Thank you, Deborah.
Bye-bye. Take care. Bye-bye, Danny.